Hello, my name is Morag Fraser. I'm a writer, former editor of the Jesuit monthly magazine Eureka Street, a sometime literary judge and reviewer, long-time teacher, and currently a board director of Kildare Education Ministries. But it's about Edmund Campion and his new book of essays written over a lifetime that I want to talk to you. Ed is one of Australia's great encouragers of Catholics, of citizens, but also of writers and thinkers of all denominations and none. I first met Ed in the 1980s, or rather, he introduced himself to me in a most unexpected way. I was writing at the time for an Australian offshoot of Dorothy Day's famous magazine of social justice, The Catholic Worker. And one day, a letter arrived quite out of the blue from Edmund Campion, postmarked Paddington. I knew of him, of course, famous Sydney Catholic priest, man about town, influential in political, environmental and literary circles and the Australia Council. Ed had taken the trouble to write and tell me, a woman he didn't know from Eve or Adam, that he'd liked an article I'd written. It was about a funeral in a Victorian country town called Marupna of a young Indian man whose family had taken me in when I was in Bombay, as it was called then, in the 1960s. I don't exaggerate when I say that that letter of ungushy encouragement set me up for a life of writing. But I'm not the only one. Ed Campion's letters and cards of encouragement, they're famous. And even in their sometimes stringent way, they've bolstered the vulnerable egos of many, many, many Australian writers and thinkers. And we owe him, the culture owes him, an enormous debt. I think Australian Catholicism owes Edmund Campion an equivalent debt. His half-century and more of rigorous, intellectually fearless chronicling of Australian Catholic life. Ed's a priest. He's also an historian by trade, and as an historian, his scan has been long and wide, and it's all there in this new book of essays written over these many years. Ed digs very deep into Australian Catholicism's 19th century origins, ethnically complex. We're not all Irish, we've not all been Irish. Into the 20th century, with the Second Vatican Council reverberating at its centre, and now 21st century Catholicism's diminished and troubled state, shadowed as it is by the revelations and the shame of clerical sexual abuse. But we mustn't let the current narrative of shame distort or dislodge completely our sense of Catholic history in Australia. Ed belongs to that generation of Catholics, lay people and clergy alike, who participated actively in church and in public life. They wrote and they spoke out on all of the issues of the day, and often with genuinely earned authority. And they had the theological wind in their sails. I'm quoting Ed now. When I was growing up, the powerful idea was transforming our generation of Catholics. This was the idea that all of us were responsible for what the church did, that there were no second-class members of the church. And further on, he adds this: we were part of an international adult education network. So when we met this idea of a new laity in our Newman Society groups at university, we went looking for someone to help us explore this novel terrain. The man we made our own was an owlish French Dominican. He was a friar, Yves Congar. From an early age, Congar had seen that the critical theological question of our time was the question of the church. To him, the word church did not mean, as it so often does in common speech, only the clergy. He gave it back its richer historical meaning, the people of God. And in another essay of the book, Ed writes this: in the meantime, the sort of history that I began to be interested in was the story of the grassroots, the people in the pews rather than the hierarchs. And so here we have it. The grit and the complicated grain of ordinary and sometimes extraordinary Australian Catholics and their lives, which gave the historian Edmund Campion his subject and the priest Edmund Campion his intellectual vocation and passion. You know what it's like to explore a country actually from the ground. There's just no substitute for it. We grasp, or we should, why foreign correspondents are so crucial to our understanding of world affairs. Edmund Campion has for so long been our correspondent on the ground, telling us about Catholics, the world we live in, a world subject to flux, to upheaval, and a world always in need of scrutiny, of loving, local, critical analysis, not just formal or ecclesial documentation. This is Ed again. The Catholics of the early 20th century and before, as historian Patrick O'Farrell has said, barracked the church as if it were a football team. We are humbler now, ready to apologise for the mistakes of the past and to admit that there will be mistakes in the future. I'll never forget the time I spent in Berlin some years back. I have part German heritage. Seeing how Germans, not all, but many, have recognised and owned the appalling history of Germany in the 20th century, it was for me both devastating and salutary. It gave me hope that change is possible. I could see it all around me. This is Ed again. Perhaps the quality which most distinguishes now from then is that we've become accustomed to change. Now, our church is always in need of reform. As a consequence, criticism, in the Socratic sense, of those in authority is a duty, not the idea that they're always wrong, but with the expectation that they're not always right. So, read this book in that spirit, as a rich reminder that in our churches, good people, good Catholic people, they're not a vanishing species, but we are human and complicated. Ed writes our history, the history of women and men in the Australian Catholic Church, tales of striding figures like Mary MacKillop, John Henry Newman. It's a history of clericalism and clerical formation, a history of anti-Semitism, of the intersection of church and state, the influence, for example, of B.A. Santa Maria. It's a history of Catholic education and the indispensable contribution made to it by religious orders. It's all here to remind us to acknowledge our shared, speckled and spotted humanity, and to help us face up to our history, and in doing so, perhaps, to help shape a future for us all. Now, quick PS. Ed notes with a certain glee that Catholics stereotypically have always been the jokers, the ones with the best, the funniest, the most ribald stories. And he provides the evidence, but you'll have to read the book to find it.